You're listening to ABC Illawarra.
And ABC Southeast. I will not forget you. I know you've probably had plenty of bank branch closures in your part of the world. We certainly have here in the Illawarra and in Wollongong in particular. Many of the major banks only really have one branch now in Wollongong. What you would call a major regional centre. I've had cause to go into banks recently for a variety of different reasons and several times over, I have to say. And all the tellers, everyone who works in the banks have been telling me how much busier they are since branches in outer suburbs of Wollongong closed. So much busier. In fact, some days are absolutely crazy. We know it's happening. Regional bank branches are closing. The federal government's looking at what alternatives they are and whether they're fit for purpose. For example, Australia Post taking on banking services rather than bank branches. Martin North is the principal at Digital Finance Analytics based here in the Illawarra. He's done a survey of households and businesses about their banking needs. He was featured in a 7:30 story earlier this week and has been good enough to give us some of his time this morning. Martin, good morning.
Hello there.
So tell us about this survey you did. What were you hoping to find out?
Yeah, so we know that banks are claiming that everyone's going online and therefore no need for branches anymore and therefore we should just shut them down. That's their line. And of course there's a cost-saving agenda there. But what I was interested in was how that differentially impacts people across the country, particularly in regional and rural areas relative to those in the city. And so I started digging into, well, how many people in regional areas still need to go into branches? And the result was amazing. Basically, 38% of the people that I surveyed in regional and rural areas said, yeah, we need to go into branches to draw cash in, out or pay cash in. A lot of them are small businesses as well, and 38% of them. Now, if you look at that compared with in suburban areas, it was 21%. In the centre of town, it was 18%. So there's a real interesting observation here. Regional communities need access to bank services, particularly cash-in and cash-out services, but also other things too. The other observation is that actually the weight of closures has been precisely in these areas where there's much, much more need for banking services. So there's something that is not right with the official line from the banks that everyone's going online and nobody needs branches anymore. And then I had some additional questions about, for example, how much notice were you given about the branch closures? And again, in regional areas, almost no notice was given. And then I asked a question about, well, so can you use online services instead? And actually, of course, in regional areas, online services are still pretty patchy.
Yeah.
And so many people said, hey, I now have to drive, kilometres and kilometres just to go to a branch to pay in cash or draw out cash. So there's a major issue here that I don't think is actually fully being understood by politicians, nor indeed by the banks themselves. There are communities that are being disenfranchised completely, so the last branch goes. And again, my surveys show that once the branch goes, the economic momentum in the community dies. So actually these banks, as they close their branches, are strangling regional communities. We need to, I think, stop further closures until we can get a better view. And the last point here, there was a task force report done quite recently by the government, but it was stacked with bankers and bankers' interests.
Yeah, right.
And so the report was actually very much on the side of the bank saying, well, everyone's going online, so you don't need branches, so we should look at Australia Post and other solutions. That is not acceptable. We know that in regional areas, there are so many people now that are struggling simply because they can no longer get back to basic banking services provided by banks who, of course, have had massive support from governments and from the RBA in recent times. So there is a community expectation that's not being met.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some sort of minimum threshold of service, some sort of mandatory service obligation style arrangement that banks should possibly have to adhere to.
Well, I think there is. I think, banks actually have a license to be banked, but actually they get massive support from government and from the RBA, right? And so, yeah, there should be a quid pro quo. There should be a medium acceptable level of service that's actually provided, a minimum service that's being provided. And look, the other observation is Australia Post's at-post service is much, much more limited. So I've done a bit of work looking at some particular regional communities where they can only now get access to banking services through Australia Post. And you can only withdraw minimal amounts of cash, and there's a lot of other transactions you can no longer do. And I got
by
hold
necessity,
of a copy of
I mean, not really the Australia Post's fault, but if it's just a sideline for you, you're not going to carry hundreds of thousands of dollars, for example.
No, by definition, they have much more limited services. Now, I had a chance to look at one of the spreadsheets from one of the banks who claimed that, well, all of the available services were actually going to be accessible either online or through Australia Post. But when you actually look down that list, about half of the services were being withdrawn completely, and another half of those left were actually not accessible through Australia Post. So, unfortunately, the banks have put up a smokescreen here, and they're claiming, digital is the way to go. And it may be true in the centre of cities where you can get lots of access to online services, and lots of people have digital services readily available. But even there, people still need cash. And by the way, they're also taking out ATMs from everywhere too. So it's making it harder and harder to use cash. And I think there's a sort of a side agenda here in removing cash from the community and from the economy when, in fact, there's more cash in circulation than ever. So things don't add up.
And sure, we might all be on the trajectory towards cashless living, but we want to make sure everyone gets there at the same time, don't we?
Well, the other point there is, remember the bushfires? When all of the electricity went down?
Yes, I do,
well,
and ATMs were shut and
Correct. The only thing that worked was actually localised cash.
Exactly, no EFTPOS, no nothing,
Exactly. So my belief is that we're sleepwalking into this digital future without actually understanding the full consequences. But banks are actually leading us by the nose and actually are fooling us. They're not giving us full information. And it's interesting, one piece of information from one of the banks said, well, nearly 80% of people are registered for banking, but actually online banking, that is, but less than half of those actually are using it regularly. So even those registered don't necessarily use online banking either. So, look, this is a really big issue. I think the politicians need to wake up. I think we need to put more pressure on our local and national politicians because, if we want our regional communities to thrive, we need to have appropriate banking services. Even in Thurrool, we used to have ANZ, CBA, they've gone. You have to go now into Wollongong, which is a reasonable journey just to do your local banking. It's not
packed.
acceptable.
Those branches in Wollongong are packed. They're the ones I was talking about, Martin, where I've had cause to go in recently. And interestingly as well, although I don't want to go off on a whole other conversation, I should let you go. We mentioned briefly scams and maybe how this time of year might be ripe for scams because people aren't checking their transactions as carefully because there are so many of them potentially. There's a lot of Australia Post type scams going around at the moment. But when I was in the bank branch, every second person was there because they'd been scammed and they wanted to talk to someone in person. They wanted to talk to a person about the threat to their money.
I'll tell you something else. If you phone up the bank and say, I've got a scam, they'll say, go into a branch, right? And if you're in a regional community and you've got to travel 400 kilometres to go and see a banker about your scam, it just shows you how stupid this whole thing is. We need a reset here. We need a different perspective in terms of banking. Banking services are critical for local communities. We need to have cash transactions there. We need to have people on the ground. In the short term, we should stop the branch closures while we actually review this. And politicians, wake up. This is a really important community issue.
Super interesting as always. Thanks so much, Martin.
Good to talk to you.
That's Martin North, Principal at Digital Finance Analytics here in Wollongong. Ruth's on the line. G'day, Ruth.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, well, thank you.
I had a conversation about local branches closing with my sister, only recently, and I mentioned that the local branch to where I live of the bank for which her son is a senior executive had closed, and she says, "Oh, you realise," he said, "it's only old people who use those branches, and they're dying off. Young people know how to use online banking." And so what's the point of keeping those branches open? And I was horrified.
Well, Ruth. Let's hope that's not actually the mindset. Let's hope.
Well, that would appear, and I mean, I argued the point with his mother, and she said she agreed with me, but that was apparently the rationale, that they're closing a lot of those branches because it's only old people and young people know how to use online banking, and so everybody will get with the new system.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for the call, Ruth. Yeah, let's hope that's not the case. But, that there is an expectation, isn't there, that everyone's heading online. Maybe not everyone is heading online. And as we heard there from Martin, sometimes the internet's pretty patchy, to say the least, in some regional areas as well where branches are closing. What's been your experience going into a bank branch? Has your life changed a lot since your local branch is closed? How often do you use your branch?